What is one country that you will never ever visit again? France, more specifically Paris, although the architecture and city itself are beautiful and steeped in history. My reason for never wanting to return is related to the police force there. I was in Paris to cover a phone launch, and after a night of socializing with other journalists, I decided to find a cheeseburger. However, the McDonald's near my hotel, despite being open around the clock, had security guards at the door who were not allowing anyone inside for some reason, possibly due to a prior incident. So I went looking for another place to eat and asked a waiter setting up chairs outside a cafe if he knew where I could find a burger. Without a word, this large waiter bumped his head against mine and went back into the cafe. A bystander who saw this came over, asked if I was all right, and offered to call the authorities to report the incident. Surprised by the situation and with a nose that was now running, I agreed and waited for the police to arrive. When they did, they inquired about what had happened, then spoke to the waiter for a short while, and then came back and detained me. Despite my objections and questions, they had me on the ground. I requested a phone call to contact my PR team, but they refused and insisted I take a breathalyzer test. I declined to take the test until I could make my call, at which point the officers surrounded me. After receiving a few more to my body, I gave way, took the breathalyzer test, and was then rushed to a hospital. Throughout this experience, a female officer was constantly yelling at me in French, only switching to English to tell me to return to England. I was scheduled to fly out that morning and was unable to inform my contacts about the situation. So after declining medical attention at the hotel, I was taken back to the station and placed in a cell with others who were also in custody. I was unable to check out of my hotel, meet my driver, or catch my flight back, so while I was in the cell, I was worried that I would be stranded and have nowhere to stay once I was released. Fortunately, a few journalists had extended their stay by an extra day or so, so once I was released, approximately 15 hours later, I was able to get in touch with them and have PR arrange my flights and hotel situation. However, I will never forget Paris for the time I was taken into custody for the misfortune. And no, I was not extremely intoxicated or behaving inappropriately, just looking for a tasty meal to enjoy. The incident with the police was quite shocking, especially since I had contacted them for help. Later, one of my friends told me that the French police are known for their tactics, as a quick internet search will reveal, but the majority of the people I encountered were friendly and pleasant. I guess it's easy to forget the realities of travel and the unexpected situations we can find ourselves in, especially in strange, different countries from our own. Story 2. Egypt. Cairo presents a challenging environment. There are watchtowers on street corners and soldiers are a common sight. During our tour with Road Scholar, a reputable travel company, we had an officer accompany us on our tour bus and we were escorted by the officer wherever we went. We also encountered dogs trained to detect and someone using a mirror to check under the bus for any items. Cairo is not well kept, with litter and signs of economic problems. The food was just average, as we were advised not to venture outside the hotel or designated tour areas to eat. The heat was intense. The handlers at the pyramid were rude. The Egyptian Museum was not a credit to the country. It was poorly organized, with inadequate labels, no security, and there was no air conditioning. Only Tutankhamun's artifacts were well cared for and secured. It's a spectacular collection, but it's poorly maintained with no curation. The new museum has just opened, and I hope it's better. Once you've seen one temple or set of hieroglyphics, you've kind of seen them all. It's all about tourist money, and the street vendors were intimidating. Even on a pleasant boat ride down the Nile, people paddled up to the boat on wooden doors selling cheap items or begging. I wouldn't go back. Another story from Egypt. I visited Sharm el-Sheikh in 2015. The hotel area was amazing. I vaguely remember it being called the Baron, and you felt like royalty there, but that was the extent of it. Outside the hotel, it felt like a place of conflict. There was trash everywhere and the roads were poorly constructed. There was nothing to see outside of the hotel except for the day trips they sold you, like snorkeling, camel riding, or going out into the desert on a quad bike. It didn't feel right to be there. Every time I went to buy water in a shop, the price would increase each day. They would tell you a price, often 2 or 3 times what you paid the day before, and you'd have to negotiate them down. I ended up saying I'd pay a certain amount and no more. When they said no, I'd leave the shop and they'd chase after me saying, okay, we can do it at this price. It was stressful to be there. If I wanted to enjoy myself, I'd stay by my hotel room, the pool, or the beach and ignore the people trying to sell me things on the beach. I was the only one in our group of five who didn't enjoy it, but I don't see the joy in having to haggle my way through the day and feeling like I've seen everything after the second day. Another story, and I have a deep love for ancient Egypt, but I still wouldn't return. I went when I was 15 years old as part of a school trip. Imagine 25 high school students and 4 chaperones, none of whom spoke the language, with one guide dedicated to taking us on our entire 11-day trip. There were cons. One student got on a camel at the pyramids for a certain amount but was not allowed down until he paid twice that. Camels are very tall, so it's not like he could easily or safely climb or jump down. There were groups of kids in many of the markets who would offer beads or small tourist items for free. Somehow, several people in my group who took those beads ended up losing their wallets in the same market. Cairo itself was unfortunately not clean. The streets and canals are filled with trash. We were told not to drink the water. Even brushing our teeth, we were told to use bottled water and to use hand sanitizer after washing our hands. On a personal note, when we were at the Sphinx, I got separated from the rest of my group. Me, alone in a country where I didn't speak the language. I searched and searched but couldn't find anyone, so I approached a guard and asked if he could help me find my group. On the way to my group, he inappropriately touched me. I was absolutely shocked. This was in broad daylight amid a crowd of other people. I just let it happen because he was at least taking me in the direction I knew my group was. The first person from my group I saw was my friend, and I had never been so glad to see him in my life. I still love the history of Egypt, but I don't think I'll ever actually go back. Another story, I've traveled to over 15 countries, and Egypt was the first that came to mind. A nice man sitting next to me on a bus to Cairo was hurt by police at the Suez Canal checkpoint. Like, people are criticizing Morocco because of beggars or annoying negotiating tactics, but in Morocco, I at least never once feared for my safety or the safety of my group. You can travel that country relatively freely and have a decent enough time if you go to the right spots, and have an okay-ish time if you go to the wrong ones. Egypt crosses a totally different line, especially given the fact that it is still considered somewhat a tourist destination, and not grouped with countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. I'd definitely say it should be widely considered and grouped closer to Afghanistan or Syria than, say, Israel or Turkey. The pyramids area was absolutely not clean, with so many people there to take advantage of you. If you are a woman or have a woman in your group, it's even worse. It's impossible to stay out past sunset as the danger and sketchiness levels go to 100. I was fortunate enough to look Egyptian while I was there, and it still didn't help much. Egypt is a challenging place. My good friend is Egyptian, and the history is amazing. And there are some great people for sure, but the place itself is tough. Alright, so I learned today that Egypt is the country where the only thing probably more ancient than the monuments is the art of negotiation. So, based on this story and some very superficial research, it looks like if you're gonna go there, we gotta bring our best bargaining face too, because we all need water in the desert, right? Story 3. I've traveled to over 40 countries in my life, including Egypt, Morocco, India, and Cameroon. However, the Gambia in West Africa stands out as the most challenging experience I've ever had. I visited there in 2009 with my girlfriend, who was also 20 at the time. The Gambia is a beautiful country with incredibly friendly people, but the way the government treats its citizens is deeply troubling. We met a local man named Jimmy Brave who lived in a hut on the beach with his young family. He was an amazing person, preparing us dinner every night and only wanting friendship in return. We gave him a generous amount of money on our last day, more than we usually would because he genuinely didn't want it. One night, we decided to explore the nightlife in the tourist area, which was considered safe. We arranged to meet Jimmy at the hotel entrance at 7 p.m., planning to have dinner and visit a few bars together. When we arrived at the front of the hotel just before 7 p.m., Jimmy wasn't there. We waited for an hour, but he still didn't show up. Assuming he had maybe forgotten, we went back to his hut on the beach through the rear exit of the hotel. His wife told us he had left to meet us over an hour ago. We searched for about 4 hours but couldn't find him. His wife suggested we call the local tourist police, and when we did, they confirmed he had been arrested for loitering in front of the hotel. We agreed to meet the head of the police and went to the police station, where things took a concerning turn. We were taken to an empty, dark room and sat at a desk. A large African man in army clothing entered. He started raising his voice at us, demanding a large sum of money to release Jimmy. We refused at first, but after an hour of negotiation, we agreed to pay £7. After waiting outside for 2 hours, they brought out the wrong person. I had to go in and identify Jimmy from a crowded cell filled with many people. Jimmy was released, and when we were far enough from the police station, he became very emotional. We immediately took him to the hospital where he stayed for 2 days at a cost of around £240. Jimmy had been mistreated just for waiting outside our hotel to take us for drinks, and he was only released because we paid. If we hadn't shown up, he said he would have been in grave danger. The police don't release criminals until someone pays the corrupt police chief. This wasn't the only instance of police corruption we witnessed during our stay. I saw people being treated unfairly and taken away just for asking for a bottle of water. I feel deeply sorry for the majority of the population in Gambia, as they are wonderful, happy people who have to live in constant fear of the police and government. If I ever become wealthy, I've vowed to return and help as many of these people as I can, ensuring that only those who truly deserve to be detained remain in custody. What a harsh reality Jimmy and people like him have to endure in his country. Like, no one deserves to live in fear and face such injustice. But if you were moved by this story and want to see more content that highlights important issues and shares powerful experiences, please also show your support by hitting the subscribe button and giving this video a like. It really does help me out. Story 4. Haiti. I went on a medical mission. One day we visited the beach but got caught in the middle of a protest. It was terrifying. The situation only calmed down when one of our translators shouted that we were medical workers. We only stayed at the beach for an hour to avoid driving back through the same area at night. When we passed through that area later, it was deserted. A few overturned vehicles were on fire, and a UN detail was stationed in an armored vehicle. On another trip to Haiti for a medical mission, we stayed away from Port-au-Prince. We didn't see much of the country, but I've decided never to return. I learned that the Kingston Charcoal Company had purchased all the wood in the country to make charcoal briquettes. The situation was already a humanitarian disaster when an earthquake struck as I witnessed supplies donated by the WHO being sold out of the back of the supply trailer. Story 5. Japan. Older people would sometimes spit at me and no one would sit next to me on the train or would make it clear they were uncomfortable during rush hour. Young people, including adults, teens, and older kids, would laugh at me, make faces, or even throw things at me, though that was only in Shibuya. It was challenging for me to find work as a teacher, even with my qualifications, because my picture had to be included and no one wanted a black teacher. I felt like a monster the entire time I was there and gradually isolated myself until I quit my jobs and only left my place at night to get food from a convenience store. The last time I went outside during the day in Japan, I was going to cancel my cell phone plan before leaving the country, and some teens pointed and laughed before running away, screaming that I was a monster. I was embarrassed when the adults looked at me and I could hear them say, "Well, look at her." It took me about 4 months back home in the United States to feel comfortable enough to leave my apartment during the day. I didn't go to Japan expecting to be loved. I just thought I'd have a nice experience in my 20s. Japan is a modern, beautiful country with some wonderful people, but I didn't have the fortune to meet them. It bothers me when I share my experience and people say, "Oh, Japan was great to me," or "You must have done something wrong." I'm glad they had a good time and I hope the next person does too, but this was my experience and that's all. Story 6. Singapore. I had the pleasure of being in great company and meeting friendly people. However, on the first day, I was in a sports bar when I was physically harmed. The person who harmed me was a man who I later learned was the boyfriend of a woman I had asked to dance. The situation escalated quickly with me ending up on the floor. People intervened after what felt like minutes. The incident itself wouldn't have been a reason not to visit again, but what followed was concerning. The bartender advised me to leave immediately and rest, suggesting that if I didn't, he would involve the police and claim I had instigated the altercation. Suspecting an injury, I called for emergency help and left the bar to wait on the street. The bartender, or manager, followed me with 2 large employees and tried to persuade me with some force to go to his back office to talk. I had to call for help loudly and repeatedly on a busy street until they left me alone. It was clear they were trying to intimidate me, and I'm thankful I didn't follow them into that office. Eventually, the ambulance arrived and I received first aid and gave my statement. Despite my efforts to get information from the police and multiple visits to both the police and my embassy, it seemed there was no interest in pursuing my case. There were security cameras, witnesses, and it happened in a lively and well regarded shopping area, yet the police showed no interest in investigating. Singapore is known for its low crime rate, but I'm quite sure my experience never appeared in any statistics. Emails and follow ups from myself, my insurance, and my local police were ignored. There was only silence and sympathy from my embassy. Story 7. Australia. As an American, I felt unwelcome on a regular basis. I'm well traveled and have never had issues with anyone. I spent 2 months there and was often called a seppo, which is considered very rude. I heard that word almost every day. When I expressed discomfort, I was told I was too sensitive and couldn't take a joke as if I were the problem. I was also teased for the way I held my utensils while eating. On top of that, I faced daily ignorant comments like, "Why do all Americans?" or "You Americans." Someone even asked me why all American phone numbers start with 555, which isn't true. Then when you turn on the news or a talk show, you hear more remarks. It doesn't seem worth the expense to be subjected to unfriendly behavior every day. I wouldn't suggest any American visit there. So if you thought American stereotypes were only a thing in the US, Australia's got a surprise for you. Story 8. Trinidad and Tobago. I attended a conference in Tobago, so my husband and I decided to stay for a week. We spent a few days in Port of Spain first. Driving there is challenging because they drive on the left side of the road and the driving style is quite aggressive. We returned to the hotel every night before dark because we didn't feel safe. Once we arrived in Tobago, we drove around the island, and every time we stopped to enjoy the scenery, someone would try to get money from us. During the conference, there was an evening event that went on for a long time with very little food. When we got back to the resort, we tried to have dinner. This was supposed to be the nicest resort on the island. We were seated and given menus, but the server returned 10 minutes later to say they were closed. We tried another restaurant on the property and the same thing happened. On the day we left, my husband and I ended up on separate Caribbean Air flights back to Port of Spain. I missed our connecting flight to Miami on American Airlines. The flight schedule from Tobago to Port of Spain seemed random, and the agent kept telling me my flight was next but couldn't say when. When I arrived at the airport in Port of Spain, I could see my American Airlines flight, but I still had to reclaim and recheck my bag. The flight attendants were kind and tried their best to help me, but I missed the flight and had to spend the night. I didn't feel comfortable being alone, but I had no choice. I had to get a hotel for the night. A woman on my flight, who was from Trinidad, was very concerned about me and ensured I would be safe, which confirmed I should just stay at the hotel. American Airlines made me buy a whole new ticket and didn't want to put me on the 7 a.m. flight to Miami because I would have an 8-hour layover until my next flight home. I told them I didn't mind and would rather wait at the Miami airport. Story 9. My girlfriend once traveled to Jamaica with her family. During the night, while she was asleep in their hotel room, a local person managed to climb up to their balcony and sneak into the room. Fortunately, her dad, who used to be part of the Georgian Special Forces, discovered the intruder and swiftly threw him out. When they went downstairs to check on the situation, the person was already gone. In another experience, it's important to understand the level of poverty that exists in many parts of Jamaica. I personally decided not to return after an incident during my honeymoon. A driver attempted to extort money from us. The lady who had arranged our transportation at the resort was involved in this scheme. The driver confronted my wife, demanding payment for a ride he claimed to have given us previously, despite the fact that he had left us stranded, forcing us to find our way back to the resort. I instructed my wife to go into the airport while I dealt with the driver. He insisted on being paid for the return trip, plus an additional amount for coming to pick us up, even though we had waited over an hour for him. Once he realized that I was not going to give in and was ready to call the police if necessary, he finally backed down and left. Story 10. Over 40 years ago, my father traveled to Colombia on a business trip. Unfortunately, he fell ill and purchased some medicine to help him through it. At the airport, as he was about to fly home, he was detained by the police and taken to a small room with a single light bulb hanging above. There, he was interrogated by the police, who were convinced he was involved in activities. They emptied his briefcase, and as one officer sifted through his business documents, another seized the bottle of medicine with a triumphant "aha." The officer examined the medicine, not finding what they suspected. Frustrated, they began to slam the briefcase on the desk, perhaps trying to reveal a hidden compartment. My father shouted, "Stop, you're going to break it." In response, one of the police officers drew his weapon and held it to my father's forehead. After breaking the briefcase, pouring out the medicine, and scattering the papers, the police finally seemed to realize that my father was not involved in activities and left the room, visibly frustrated. My father, shaken and sweating, collected his papers into his damaged briefcase and made his way to the airplane. He was certain the officer was about to harm him. Each time he recounted this story, he would conclude by saying he would never ever return to Colombia. Well, if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.